Welcome back to our series on value and competency development. In module number 2, we're going to be focusing on competency development as a risk reduction activity in supporting your competency development investments through an analysis of risk reduction. You're going to hear in this series 4 specific points relative to total cost of your development activity. What is the outcome value versus not doing any training or competency development? Thirdly, what is the effectiveness of the training that you're delivering? And fourthly, what is the average value of the development investment that you're going to make? So focusing on those 4 parts, I think you're going to enjoy the insights creatively communicated by our CEO, Mr. Ford Brett.
Okay, this next approach to valuing competent people is valuing skill development as risk reduction. And basically what we do here is we compare the risk and the cost and risk weighted value of training versus no training. We're going to do a driver's ed example to kind of show how it would work. Then we have 5 patrolman examples, but given our time, we'll only be able to cover 2. And then we'll show how you can use this approach to make investments in training and development, just like we use it to make investments in large E&P projects. So basically what I'm saying here is we value a lot of our investments in the oil business itself with this approach. Is it worth drilling a well? Should we build a gas plant? And so forth. And we can use the same approach to determining the value of skill development. And of course, the reason we want to do this is to be able to understand what the value of a person is and to understand, are we spending the right amount of resources investing in developing skills? If you don't actually quantify something, I'm going to claim it's not really an investment. It's, and it's expense and it's a cost. And what happens to costs? They get cut until it kind of hurts, and then you raise it $1. People will spend a lot of money investing in things if they have certainty around the return on that investment. And that's what we're going to talk about here in a second. So how to quantify the value of skills using the concept of risk reduction. So there's 4 steps here. 3 of them are easy. 1 of them is possible, but we don't even try it. And that causes us to keep from doing this properly. So the first thing you do is pretty easy, is measure the cost of the development activity versus no development. What's the training cost, trainer cost, expenses, so forth? What's the participant's time cost? That's the cost of development. Any hidden training costs, administration overheads, and you can pretty much accurately calculate these. You might have to estimate some of them, but they should be pretty accurately estimated. What's it going to cost to develop somebody versus not doing it at all? Next thing you have to do is measure the outcome value of a competent person versus an incompetent person. Basically, we know situations where we have competent people do the job. What's that cost us? We know situations where we have incompetent people do the job. What's that cost us? And compare those 2 situations. Or we know we have competent people that can do the job properly and they have a certain value, and incompetent people. You might need to estimate these. And so I'm going to say this is very easy, but it's relatively easy to say what happens to the costs in value if you do it right versus if you do it wrong. Then you estimate and measure if you can, and some people actually can measure this, but normally we have to estimate the effectiveness of a development activity. Basically, what's the likelihood that you'll have the good outcome versus the poorer outcome if it's done properly with a competent person? So in other words, how likely are we to get a good result if we actually do the development activity? And so this is possible to do, and I'll show you some examples of this, but we don't even try most of the time. And so this is where we stop. We don't even get any further than this. If you've done step 3, step 4 is easy, which is to calculate the average development, the value of the development activity. So what's it actually end up being worth on average if I do it or if I don't do it? And this is easy, but we don't try it, so we hardly ever do it. And so the step 3 here is the harder step, but I'll show you examples of how this can work and what this is. So I'm going to give you a driver's ed example. And so here's the situation to go through these steps. Measure the total cost of the development activity with no development. Well, in driver's ed, it's simple. It cost me $500 to send my kid to driver's ed. Good, know that. Second, Measure the outcome value of development with no development. Okay, great. If I'm going to add my teen to the policy for 4 years, it's going to cost $4,000, and I get a 15% discount if they have driver's ed. So it's going to cost $3,400. There, cost of development versus no development. Estimate the likelihood that the development will create the outcome. Well, let's see. If I don't do it, it's going to cost me $4,000, 100% chance. If I do it, it's going to cost me $3,400 because that's what the deal is. So is this worth it or not? Well, let's see. If I don't do it, development's going to cost me $4,000. If I do it, development's going to cost me $3,900. Dang, I'll do it. I'll save $100. Let's do it. I should include the cost of my teenager's time involved in this, but that's free. I want to get him out of the house anyway. So let's do it. Return on investment's 20%. Good idea. Interestingly, those aren't the real numbers. These are the real numbers. It cost to add a teen in my house to policy for 4 years was $2,400, $600 a year, and the discount wasn't 15%; it was only 10%. But the driver's ed still cost $500. So basically, what happened in this situation was it's going to cost me, on average, $260 to do this. Interestingly, what's this? I thought driver's ed was good. Well, insurance companies know this, and insurance companies know that parents will pay for driver's ed for a 10% discount, and insurance companies know that they'll get parents to do this because parents have a very different risk-weighted calculation. What's their calculation? Their gut calculation is this. Dang it, if there's a small percent chance that my child's going to have a major accident, that's a lot of money. And if driver's ed can reduce that by a very small amount, that's going to save a lot of money. And so the return is not negative. The return is 2,000% because I want to reduce the chance of some injury happening to my child by a very small amount. So how can we use this in our business? Well, I've got some examples here. We're going to go through an example of an electronic submersible pump program and go through a value of a competency management system. There are other examples, casing design, well site supervisor programs, et cetera, we can talk about. But in the interest of time, we're going to go through two of these approaches. So here's a situation where we have electronic submersible pumps that we use quite a bit, and our vendor's been designing, specifying, installing these. And we got a lot of failures, and they're $400,000 for failure to remediate and lost production and so forth. And so is a training a program to develop engineering staff to properly design and install these worth it? Well, let's see what would happen in a particular case using this approach. Well, if we have a program that's going to cost us $4,000 in participant time and $2,000 in training program cost to get this done, and so that's where we know what the cost is. What's the value of our $400,000 failures? And 50% of the time we have one of these failures. Can we reduce the failure rate by 50% through this training program, through a program of actually properly designing, installing, specifying electronic submersible pumps? If you could do that, what would happen is that the risk-weighted value of this would be $94,000, or a return of 1,500%, 15 times your money. The question is, can you actually reduce the failure rate by 50%? And the point of that is does the training actually end up affecting what goes on in reality? And can it actually improve what's going on? And so we have a case of no development costs $200,000. 50% of the time, there's a $400,000 error. The development costs $106,000, and so the return is $94,000. If you had a program of 15 engineers doing a bunch of ESPs, this is a $750,000 program. So what's hard to calculate here? We can calculate these costs pretty effectively. We can calculate the value of a success or unsuccessful case. The question is, does the development program actually affect the outcome, which is the reduced failure rate in the ESP programs? So if you can have a training program that is very effective to cut the failure rate to 5%. In fact, exactly the reason that these things are failing is because they're getting designed and implemented improperly. Then you have a case here where the program is 3,000% return on investment, or so $2.6 million. So this is a way to begin to understand this. And this is the kind of analysis people use to make large investments all the time in our industry. The question is, can we use this for developing people? And to do that, you have to get an understanding of what's the effect of the training on the outcome. And so what's wrong with the math here? Well, the math's nothing wrong with the math. It's exactly the way to do this. What's wrong with the big idea here? I guess there's nothing wrong with the big idea here. What's hard to do here? What's hard to do here is to understand how training actually affects the outcome. Is that impossible? No, it's not impossible, because we can talk about what competent people can do and know that incompetent people are going to make mistakes. People always matter. And so we begin to understand what the probabilities of these things happening are is the key to understanding what the value of this is. So here's another example of this approach for a competency management system. So we have a competency management system with a cost of $5,000 a year for 200 users. So it's $1 million a year. What is that competency management system? So we identify the competencies. We have training to close the specific development gaps. We have the user costs. We have the system costs, all of it. So $5,000 a year per person to kind of make sure they have the right skills. Well, is it worth it or not? Well, if there are no errors to prevent, or if the system doesn't find and prevent any errors before they're committed, then the answer is it's not worth it. So development cost is $5,000 a year. There are no errors to prevent. We don't change the errors. What's happened? Well, this has cost us $5,000 a year per person. And so this is an example of overtraining. If you have a system that doesn't actually affect the outcome, then what's it worth? The answer is it costs, it's not worth. What if we have a system with the same system that, but there are competency errors that average $100,000 a year in terms of downtime or increased maintenance, or in terms of reduced income or system errors? And what if the system can find and prevent a third of those? Well, we know the cost is $5,000 a year. We know there's $100,000 a year on average of performance-related human errors that our competency would have addressed. If we can reduce a third of those, then the risk-weighted value of this is worth $28,000 per year per person. So we're basically getting 5 times our money back. So the question about whether a competency management system is worth it or not depends upon the cost, yes, but mainly depends upon what does the competency management system do in terms of delivering you outcomes, and how reliable is it in delivering those outcomes. And you can understand these by looking at operations and understanding the human capability component of performance in those operations. And almost all the errors we have some form of human action that either caused it or could have prevented it. And the question is making sure our people have the skills they need to be able to take the appropriate action at the appropriate time. The key to doing this is getting some measurable outputs, understanding what they are, and the role of skill and competency in managing or delivering those outcomes. And so in drilling, facility operations, off-spec products, invisible lost time, non-productive time, costs of major events. We have a number of these things. The key to this is understanding the outcomes and quantifying those and determining how skill relates to the outcomes. That previous analysis I showed you was for 1 year. Properly, you would do this for many years. So you wouldn't just say what happens in 1 year for ESP prevention or in 1 year for a competency management system. You would say, in this particular case, a unit loss of $1 million a year in off-spec product, or non-productive time in operations, or whatever. If on average, if you could change competencies to reduce that by 50%, and you spend $100,000 a year getting it set up and $100,000 a year of staff time, so $200,000 a year in year one getting it going and $150,000 maintaining it, and the net present value of that investment would, over 5 years, would be $800,000, return 400%. Simple return on investment. And so the idea here is looking at the risk, how competency management and proper skill gap identification and closing would over time affect the outcome of an organization. So there's 4 steps to doing this. Measuring the total cost of development activity. That's easy to do, accurate. Measure the value of the competent versus incompetent person. That's easy to do. Estimate the likelihood that the development activity will create the proper outcome. This is a little bit harder to do. You can do it by looking at operations and statistics over time and understanding with root cause analysis how human capability affects performance. The last step is easy, calculating the average cost of a development activity. The third step is that we normally don't do. It's knowable, but we too often don't try. How do you start with this? Just expert opinion. Get the people who know how to do it and say, what's the key things that people need to know and be able to do to create the outcome? You can collect data to refine the estimates as you go with that. And so basically what this can help us do is prioritize our development based on the value of outcomes, can understand what skill gaps we have in the organization and quantify the value of closing those skill gaps, and over time be able to understand the effectiveness of our development activities.